I came back from Lincoln, Nebraska, or Omaha, on the Burlington Zephyr, that sleek silver train that looked very streamlined then, and almost 70 years ago, and oh yeah, more than 70 years ago. And I would sit in the bar car at the back of the train, which was somehow surrounded by windows, and one could look out the endlessly flat landscape of Nebraska until we got to McCook, Nebraska, where the base that I was serving on was, and the newspapers were unloaded, and so was I. And ordinarily I would then be met by vehicle that would take all of us, the papers and myself, back to the base. And this time I was met by a contingent which took the newspapers to wherever, but did not take me, but presented me with all of my belongings and instructions for going elsewhere. I was not to return to the base because I had written an editorial, which I ordinarily did. Generally, the editorials I wrote had to do with life on the base and that sort of thing. This one was about the problem, the racial problems, which of course existed in the Army at that point, in the Army Air Force, in which I was. And we had a large contingent of black soldiers, as well as, of course, a larger contingent of white soldiers at the base. And the general rule in the Army at that point was that above the Mason-Dixon line, there was a rather freer intermix of the races, and below the Mason-Dixon line, it reverted to the traditional Southern black and white separation. However, as I recall vaguely, and maybe this is all legend in my mind, or some of it anyway, the commander of our post, I think was a colonel, was a Southerner, who later became, I think, a rather famous general in the Air Forces. He enforced the Southern interpretation of the Mason-Dixon line rule. And what would happen was there would be separate movie showings for the blacks and the whites, and separate entertainment showings for the blacks and the whites, and the like. The blacks were, even in the North, were in separate units and in separate barracks. That was not the color line was still obeyed, but the rules were different above the Mason-Dixon line. They were much freer and much more equal than they were below. But in our base, that was not observed. So I wrote about this in the editorial. Dumb. I don't know if I was a corporal yet or not, editor of this local little newspaper that came out once a week. And what happened was, when the newspaper came out, a copy of it was sent to the headquarters in Denver. I think it was the 2nd Air Force or something like that. And I had friends there that I had made. And they would read it over and see that it was all proper and safe before the paper was released. Well, they read it over, and it wasn't proper, safe, or kosher, and it would not be released, and I was then sent elsewhere. And this is the next chapter of how I won the Second World War and why I'm part of the greatest generation. Now pay attention, because there aren't many of us left. And so I was sent immediately from the McCook, Nebraska train station. I don't remember how, but probably back to Omaha. And then on to Savannah, Illinois. Now, Savannah, Illinois, as the name seems to imply, was in the deep south of Illinois, which has nothing to do with the Chicago, Illinois area. They're entirely separate cultures. And a couple of interesting things happened. One of them, for whatever reason, I had to go through Chicago and had a layover of 2 days, and that was very nice. I didn't know Chicago at all. I was 19 or something, and Chicago at that point was the great second city, and as it turns out, I had relatives there, and the custom amongst Jews from Poland, etc., was that if you passed through a city where you had relatives, you were obligated to see them, whether you knew them or not. So that was part of what happened there. And the other part was that I got to see Chicago and go to the museum, great museum, the Art Museum, and the auditorium building, I think it was called, I don't remember what. I think it was Sullivan who designed it, a very great and important building, was used as a USO headquarters, and we could be put up there. And as it turned out, where we were staying, I mean the rooms where we had double-decker beds, down the hallway, I opened a door, and it opened onto this great auditorium. Right there. I was up above, looking down. It's a very famous auditorium that exists, I believe, to this day. And it was just a wonderful experience to see this phenomenal auditorium. And I remember that moment very clearly. And then the rest of during this period was I was put in touch by my mother's family, the Weingards, to be in touch with cousins, first cousins of my maternal grandmother. And I called them and introduced myself, and they were very excited and appeared shortly thereafter, within an hour or so, and took me to their house. And these were people who knew my grandmother's family, they were Greenspans. This is the same family that Alan Greenspan came of. He's kind of second or third cousin of ours. And they were very hospitable and very good people. And they had started a dress factory there in Chicago and had done very well. They were dress manufacturers, and they were, I think I was seeing the second or third generation of them. And the oldest one knew my grandparents in Poland, and he had nothing good to say about my grandfather, the wine cart. He was, of course, Greenspan, and he said that, you know, the wine guard, my grandfather, had married my grandmother, Sarah Rachel Rochel, when they were teenagers, and that they then had gone on to Leeds in England, where my mother was born. And he said that my grandmother had been a very beautiful girl. I think they felt that because she was blonde and blue-eyed, which rarely happened amongst Jewish girls. But he said that my grandfather was something of a brute, to which I could attest, and that he had ruined her life. And I'll go into that another time, about her life. I think in a section I'm going to call 6403 23rd Avenue, which I think is a wonderful title. That'll be that section. Meanwhile, having seen them and found relatives that I did not know at all before, who filled me in on some of my family history, I was then on my way to Savannah, Illinois, in the south of Illinois. And one approached that, and it was very interesting because you saw these high, grass-covered hills, very high, grass-covered, but they were hills, not mountains. And you didn't know why. They looked very strange. And later on you found out these were really ammunition dumps. And there were great structures inside these hills that had been built and then covered with this sod so that they looked like hills. But actually, the railroad would go into the base, and then an elevator would raise the cars up 7 or so stories to the top of these hills, or whatever floor in between, and munitions could be loaded or unloaded to be stored or shipped. And what I remember, and this is very spotty, is we would go into these, we'd be in a freight car, and we'd go up to one floor, and we'd be assigned to a whole series of these big storage shelves, and then we'd carry great big shelves for cannon from the storage units to the freight car. And they were very heavy, terribly heavy, certainly for a nance like myself to carry some, you know, here I was a creative, intellectual type, and I was carrying shells that seemed to have been there from the First World War. They seemed to be rusting out on our shoulders from there, and I must be making this up, but they seem, in retrospect, to have weighed 125 pounds on my shoulder from the storage unit, the shelves, all the way to the freight cars, and then we would hand them to somebody else. And this was about the time, shortly after the Battle of the Bulge, and when the Germans were resisting the American advance in France and the like, and we were panicking. We were sending anything we had over there. Of course, as brilliant as the German High Command was, and they were, it was just a matter of very short time before they would lose. They knew it, and we knew it. So why we were getting so hysterical, I don't know. At any rate, all of this, after several weeks of this, or perhaps a month and a half, I don't remember at all how long, I came down with a very high fever and a pain in my neck. And we were standing at attention in some drill, and all of a sudden I fell over and had to be taken to the hospital, to the infirmary. In retrospect, we know precisely what it was. It was infectious mononucleosis, which in those days they didn't know. They had no idea. They didn't know what infectious mononucleosis was. Today it's very easily taken care of. In those days I had no idea. So I was in the hospital and had this high temperature and this pain in my neck, and these young doctors who were the medics, totally incapable, because they were new young doctors that had been drafted in or even trained while in the Army, just could throw anything they had at it. So they had just discovered penicillin. And penicillin was oil-based, I believe, that time, and it was given to you in a needle this size, literally, in the oil base. And I would get it in my backside by some, not by a doctor, but by some, medical assistant. And they would frequently hit the bone when they did it. Well, after 125 shots, they decided that penicillin didn't work on that. So they went to their next miracle drug at that time, to sulfur drugs. And they loaded me with sulfur drugs. Now, why I never developed some resistance to penicillin, I don't know. I can still take it without having any negative reaction. But I do have a sulfur reaction. I can't take sulfur drugs anymore. So eventually, I think on my own, in spite of the drugs, I got well enough to get out of there, though. They put me back into formation and I fell over again. This went on, I think, 3 times. Eventually, I got out of it. I think at that point, they decided Savannah and I didn't go together anymore. So they sent me to Greensboro, North Carolina, to the Overseas Replacement Depot, ORD. And by this time, they had stopped shipping personnel over to the European theater, and they were now shipping people over to the Pacific theater, which was winding down too, but still had a ways to go. And I don't know if I'd said this before, but I had been trained as an ammunition, no, I had been trained as a, what was I trained as? Not very good training, I can't even remember. I wasn't a very good exemplar of it, but I was trained to be a caliber 50 machine gunner in a bomber, you know, in one of those little bubbles either at the back or at the side of the bomber, to protect the bomber from oncoming fighter planes. And part of that training, and this was at Denver, when I was at Denver way back then, was that you took apart, you disassembled and reassembled a caliber 50 machine gun blindfolded. So you were able to do it in fighting conditions. And a few guys in our unit lost their fingers in the process. Somehow I did not. But one of the reasons I was sent to McCook was that's where they were assembling the units to go into these bombers. But their actuarial tables, which had predicted how many they would need, turned out not to hold up because we had not lost as many caliber 50 machine gunners as they expected. So there were too many of us around. We hadn't been killed off fast enough. That's how come I got by and lived to tell the tale of how I won the Second World War. Now, I arrived at Greensboro, and this was, in many ways, the best part of my service. It was a very big base. It was stationed, the base was laid out on what had been part of the Cone Mills, C-O-N-E mills, big cotton fabric manufacturers, part of which had its headquarters in Greensboro. They had other factories throughout North Carolina. And the Cone Mills were owned by the Cone family, which for some reasons wasn't spelled C-O-H-E-N, but C-O-N-E, Cone Mills. And Greensboro, turns out, had a very vibrant Jewish community. It was a well-to-do, middle-class North Carolina town with a relatively educated population. And one of the earliest things that I noticed was pretty much to the center of town was a small park, and there were three large religious buildings around it, and that one was Catholic, and one was Protestant, and one was Jewish, and they were of equal proportions and obviously designed by good architects. And for whatever reason, I wasn't a synagogue goer at all, but I did go. And inside was a Reformed Jewish congregation. And of course, I hadn't been raised in a Reformed Jewish congregation. I had been brought up in a conservative, closer to Orthodox, and these are very different. I mean, you felt you had somehow wandered into a Protestant ceremony when you went to this Reformed Jewish. service. At any rate, one of the families that entertained Jewish soldiers, hospitality, were a remarkable family, the Kleins, Al and Min Klein. And Al was, a salesman, businessman, who was doing quite well, and they had a very nice house in a very nice near suburban area. And every Sunday, absolutely every Sunday, they would entertain soldiers, primarily Jewish soldiers, because they would feel more comfortable there than other. But the whole town was very hospitable. It was a very nice place to be. And there was always a meal, generally based on pasta of some kind. Min Klein, who turned out to be a very close friend of mine over my life from there on in, was a very interesting woman. And they had 2 children, with whom one of whom I've kept in touch with on and off, the daughter, and Min and I became very close friends, and very interesting people came through there, people who in later life turned out to be important members of the government, the judiciary and the like, and people who turned out to work in the Foreign Service, and some who went on to work in religion, and you find as you spot around dedications to the Kleins, especially to men, in books and the like, and that she was quite remarkable. She was I don't know if she was born in this country, but they settled, I think, in Oxford, North Carolina, which was a small town. I don't know what her father did for a living, and there weren't many Jewish families there. And she remembers that when she was very young, on the high holidays, they would go to a larger community, a bigger town, to be part of a bigger congregation. And she remembers early on, before they had an automobile, they would go on a horse-drawn wagon to this other town. And eventually she gravitated to Greensboro and met Alan, married Alan. They did well, and they certainly had a very comfortable middle-class life in a very nice house with blacks coming in to wait on them, take care of the house. And she was very clear in treating her house help with respect. It was very nice to see. It was not very Southern what she was doing. And as a matter of fact, the housekeeper, whom I knew all the time I was there, Min was somehow instrumental in helping her to get her children through college. And one became a lawyer and the other a doctor, which in part for a black family in the South at that time was a real accomplishment. And Min was instrumental in that. So you have some idea of what kind of woman she was. She and I had a very close, affectionate relationship. And while I was there, I became, I didn't want to be sent over to the Pacific region area, so I wandered around to the newspaper office, which they put out, I think, 3 issues a week. That's how big a base it was and how important it was. And I said, here I am. I said, can you use me? And they said, well, we need a features editor. And I said, well, I'm perfect for that. So I became the features editor. In general, what it meant is that I would pursue and write articles that were not totally news, but has some kind of cultural or historical or political interest. As a result, very frequently, this was an air base that for some reason was used as a stopover on the way to Washington. And so I got to interview the Prime Minister of Australia, New Zealand, places like that, and to write articles about my interviews with them, and also to write reviews of movies and concerts and the like. And this led to the local newspaper in Greensboro, one of them, I don't remember which one, to ask if I would do their musical reviews, classical music reviews. I didn't know the first thing about classical music to think. I mean, I had grown up listening to it on WQXR in New York when I was doing my homework. And part of my mother's interest, because she played a very bad violin in one of the WPA orchestras, so I had some slight introduction. So there I was writing reviews of classical concerts. It was a wonderful education I was getting all this way along. And so I was doing that. It was a great job to have. And they didn't want to let me go, so I never got sent over to the Pacific Theater. And at the same time, there was a need for men in the casts of Women's College, University of North Carolina in Greensboro, which doesn't exist anymore. It's now the Greensboro part of the University of North Carolina. It's not women's or the like. But it was Women's College at that point. So they always needed men in the theater department for their productions. So I began to act in their theater productions. And that was very nice. And they had a summer season, and I somehow managed to squeeze my life into their summer season. It was very, I don't know how it all happened. And I stayed on after I did not go back to New York to be out of the Army, Air Force. I did that right there in North Carolina, I think in Fayetteville. And I had stayed on at Greensboro, and as a matter of fact, registered in a course, took some credits there, and acted in the summer company, and that was very good. It was a good company, and I learned a lot, and I had good roles. And then I went down to Chapel Hill, which is a great campus for the University of North Carolina, which in those days didn't have a paved road in it, but it was a wonderful place. and I took a course, I think 1 semester there. I can't remember. And eventually, I went back to New York, and that was the end of how I had won the Second World War. And during that time in Greensboro, I used to frequent a very good bookstore in Greensboro, and I had developed, before that even, interest in the 100 Great Books program at St. John's College. And the owner, a very nice woman, said, "Oh, there's a young man here who goes to St. John's. Would you like to meet him?" I said, "Of course." So we got to meet, and this was Gene Thornton, who became a friend of mine. And so through that connection, I applied to St. John's College, the 100 Great Book School, and went there for an interview, and they couldn't fit me into that year. And I was faced with the dilemma of, should I hang around for another year and wait, or should I think I had been offered for some, I don't remember how, a scholarship at a school in Pittsburgh, at Carnegie Mellon, which was not called Carnegie Mellon at that point. It was a separate school and had a very good theater department, and I had been offered a scholarship there. So I had to weigh that against waiting around a year to get into St. John's. And for whatever reason, I decided to wait the year and to spend it in New York City. And New York at that point, in 1946, was very exciting for the year, wonderfully exciting. With the war and all of that, it had become the center of Western culture. And during that time, my friend Herman Small, who went to 4th grade with me, was in New York, and he decided to come to St. John's too. So we had a year off, and I lived in a part of the time in a $12 a month cold water flat on the East Side, Lower East Side. And we got odd jobs. One of the odd jobs we had was working at ushers in Carnegie Hall. So I began to get my full classical music, find what I had gotten wrong in my reviews and the like. But we finished an afternoon concert as ushers, Carnegie Hall, and we'd run down to Broadway, and we'd second act at Broadway shows. You know, you'd wait for the intermission and go in and find an empty seat. So you'd get to see half the show for nothing, or 2/3 of the show for nothing. And we did that, and at the same time, student artist life in the village was very exciting, and I took a course at the New School with W.H. Auden in Shakespeare, and it was well attended, and it was my first concerted introduction to Shakespeare, though I had been in a very good Shakespeare production at Brooklyn College for that half year I'd been there, of Taming of the Shrew. And I had an important secondary role, and it was an eye-opener about what these were, because a number of the people were professionals, and I learned what I couldn't have before then that. So that, what I remember about, I can't remember much of what Auden had to say about Shakespeare, but one day he came into the class, and it was a big class that filled the auditorium, and he walked down the aisle carrying a Victrola, you know, a record player, and he put it up on the lectern and plugged it in, and he had brought a record with him, and he got that set up, and he said, and today we are going to deal with the Merry Wives of Windsor. And he said, it isn't worth dealing with. So we'll listen to Falstaff by Verdi, which is worth dealing with, and upon which it is based. And that was it. That's what I remember of that. And so that was that year in New York. It was a very rich year. And in a way it was very good that I didn't get into St. John's that first year. And the following year I went to St. John's and spent 4 years at St. John's. And that another time, I think. Is that enough? How long?